Hi everyone, welcome to another video on Jujutsu Kaisen Phantom Parade. Now in today's video I'll be making a tier list on Recollection, but I'll be focusing specifically on the level 1 skill or the dupe 1 skill in order to help you guys decide which Recollections do you want to dupe up first. Now if you don't know what I'm talking about, basically when you have any Recollection in this game, you are always going to start off with one ability of that Recollection. However, when you actually limit break it or essentially dupe it out, what you're going to unlock is a second ability which is automatically activated, and that's basically going to be very useful because what happens is that you can get certain Recollection that may seem very average when you just look at its base ability. However, once you actually dupe them out and check out its additional auto skill that it's able to have, it's actually all of a sudden pretty strong, and those should be your priorities when deciding which ones to spend your dupes on. Now the way you dupe it up is obviously you could get another Recollection of the same kind, or you can get those universal crystals in order to dupe them up, Recollection bits crystals. And basically the way you can get this, everyone should be able to have at least one or two by now if you're starting from like a day one player. Basically in this event right now, Homesick Horizon, you are able to get one in one of your prize pools. So basically you can just farm this, and by the time you reach prize pool 6 you should be able to get one. The other way of getting there would be going through the likes of Formidable Foe. The first time you beat a stage, well, some of the stages, the first time you beat it, you're gonna get this fragment of Recollection bits, and what you can then do is you can go into your exchange shop here, and then you can actually exchange for them here. So for example, I already currently have 15 of this, and you cost only 10 in order to get one, so I can get another dupe if I really want to. And then the last way of getting those universal dupe would be from this. Now you can get some of those currency once again from different events. The other way of doing it is actually recycling through any Recollections that you don't really want. And basically this is a good way of you recycling some of your less used R or SR Recollections, and then eventually converting them to enough currency to actually get a universal SSR dupe. So that's basically the main ways of how you can dupe it out. And like I said, vast majority of players should probably have at least one or two of this by now, and that's kind of why I want to talk about which are the best Recollection that you want to spend your dupes on. Now, there are some Recollections that you won't see on this tier list, and those are normally going to be the ones which you can get either by beating different contents in the game or events, and therefore you can actually farm all 5 dupes of them. So for example, the 4 SSR Recollection that you can get by beating Formidable Foes, and also the 2 SSR Recollection you can get during the events that's going on right now. Because you can actually just play those game modes and actually just max them out, obviously there's no need for you to spend your universal dupes on them, no matter how good those may be. Alright, so that's basically kind of the main content. Now let's go into the tier list itself. So starting off at the top, we have known standard. This is going to be okay, I'm about to say something fairly controversial. I know a lot of people think this is one of the best Recollection in the game. I agree if you have it at dupe 1. If you do not have it at dupe 1, I think it's just an above average Recollection. But what doesn't make it insanely strong and one of the best Recollection in the game is the fact that once you dupe it out, you are able to start off every single wave with some ultimate energy, and that's going to be massive. This can basically allow your Gojo to use 3 ults in one battle if you plan it carefully. And basically that's basically what makes this Recollection so good. So whenever you see people talk about why non-standard is one of the best Recollection in the game, I would argue it's not due to its base ability, it's actually due to the additional effect you get from dupe 1. I'll be making a separate video on build for Gojo in the future, and in that video I'm going to talk specifically about why non-standard is not actually as good as other people make it out to be, but I'm not going to ignore the fact that once you actually dupe it out once, it's all of a sudden become one of the best Recollection in this whole game. So that's kind of why it's going to be one of your first priority. And then you have 2 other Recollections which basically have the same effect when you dupe them out once, and that's basically going to give you a plus 10 custom energy to your whole team. That's going to be incredibly useful because basically right now one strategy a lot of people use, including myself, use a lot, is basically including Kaito in your team to act as a battery so that you can use your buff every single turn and stack up your buff, etc. Now, if you actually have any of those Recollection and you use it in conjunction with another Recollection, maybe if you have both of them, let's say, and you put them in your team, all of a sudden you don't need to have Kaito in your team anymore. And all of a sudden you free up your entire team slot in your team for a completely new character, for another buffer or for another DPS, etc. And that's kind of why it's incredibly useful when you actually unlock them, and that's kind of why I highly recommend duping them out as well. All right, and then this one is a bit of a tricky one depending on the timing when you pull it off. Basically what happens is that I think when your HP is below 50%, you are going to suddenly get a boost of 1,000 ultimate energy. 1,000 ultimate energy is most of the time is going to be enough to charge up someone's ultimate gauge completely, and that's just crazy. Now obviously there is a bit conditional depending on when your HP get lower to less than 50%. So there is a bit of RNG element on in terms of how useful it will be in battle, depending on when this actually get triggered. But the fact is, in this game, restarting a battle doesn't cost anything. So actually, you can pretty much always play around restarting the battle till you actually have this recollection work in your favor in like a really favorable situation. And just imagine a free ult in this battle is going to be absolutely massive on certain DPS. Now, granted, it won't be as useful on Gojo because Gojo doesn't take any damage, so his HP can't get below 50%. But imagine using it on someone like Nobara, or maybe even using it on a support character. For example, using it on Kaito, who is able to use his ultimate buff twice in a row. That can be absolutely massive. So that's kind of why I do think this is a very, very good recollection to dupe out. And then we have this one. Give me a second. Let me refresh my memory on what this one actually does. Um, Okay, so when you dupe this one time, every single time when you hit a crit, you're going to recover 200 of your special attack gauge. So once again, your ultimate gauge. This is very strong, especially because you normally put this on a physical attacker because its base effect is for boosting physical attack. And if you take a look at the physical DPS in this game right now, I think it's just Maki and Yuji. Yuji has a buff which buff up his own critical hit rate, and that basically means you are much more likely to get your 200 extra attack gauge every single turn because Yuji already have a really high crit rate from his buff. So that's kind of why it's really good on Yuji. And then if you put on Maki, Maki has an AoE attack which doesn't cost any curse energy at all, so you can use that every single turn. I don't know how it stacks up when you have multiple critical hits on multiple enemies at the same time, whether you count it once or count it twice. But just think about it. Even if it's only counted once, you'll be using AoE attack. Very high likelihood at least one of the enemy hit by that AoE will be a crit, and then you charge up your special attack gauge instantly. So this is actually incredibly useful when you actually think about it that way, and that's kind of why I also highly recommend duping it up. Now then we have this one. This one basically give a static, I think 20% damage increase, and that's it. Now, 20% doesn't sound like much, but it's for every single turn in the battle. And if you actually think it that way, it's incredibly strong because basically there are certain recollection which you have to activate just to get like a 20 or 30% buff for multiple turns. And this one, you don't have to do anything. It's just a passive ability and it gives you 20% for every single turn. And it can be increased even more if you have more like Tokyo students in your team. So that's kind of why this is very good. And then we have those two SR recollections. Both of them give a starting buff to your ultimate gauge energy. So once again, ultimate is very important. Whether you can have your ultimate ready one turn early or not can change the flow of the battle massively. So that's kind of why I recommend keeping hold of those dupes on those SR and dupe them up as well. Okay, then we have the next S tier. Now, basically, vast majority of the time when we are talking about recollections, we are kind of talking about duping them up once to unlock their additional effect, because the only other benefit from duping up a Recollection would be then duping them up 3 times, in which case you get a slight buff on your initial base effect. So basically it could be something like initially it would be a 70% buff on your attack when you use an ultimate. Now it becomes like 75% increase, and that basically a lot of time is a very small increase and just not worth it on vast majority of Recollections. Rather than duping one Recollection 3 times, you are normally going to be much better off duping 3 different Recollections to their dupe one to unlock that additional effect. However, there are some special exceptions, and one that I want to point out is going to be this one. And the reason why this one I feel like can be an exception is because what this one increases ultimate gauge, and a 5% extra buff in attack may not make a massive difference. However, a tiny bit of extra ultimate gauge, which can let you potentially have your ultimate ready 1 turn earlier, that is actually going to make a massive difference. Now, because it's only a tiny bit of an extra increase, your ultimate gauge, I'm not sure how often that will come in clutch in the actual battle. So this is something I still don't think it's going to be as important as just try to get some of the higher rarity ones, higher tier ones into dupe one instead. However, because there has the ability to change the flow of the battle completely, I kind of want to respect that fact that this is probably one of the few Recollection that is probably actually worth duping all the way up to 3 dupes. However, if you, in all honesty, if you have the choice between duping this 3 times versus duping some of the other Recollection or 3 other Recollection to dupe one, I'll probably still lean towards duping 3 different Recollections to dupe one instead. But I'm just want to respect the fact and point this out. Okay. And then we have this one. Now, this one is something you can actually farm in the exchange shop by, having your friends borrowing character or fuels. So this is something because you can farm so easily. I'm just gonna say might as well put that as 3 dupes. You're not gonna get much benefit from wasting something on this. Now this one actually have a pretty nice effect as well because it's one of the better SR Recollections. It's basically just a damage buff for your whole team for 2 turns, I believe. It's a pretty handy one, and an extra 5% there can definitely help. And since you can farm it, you might as well dupe it all the way up to 3 dupes. Okay, now let's move on to the A tier. Starting out with this one basically gives a 10% damage reduction for 4 turns. 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but what does make this slightly nice is that it can last for 4 turns, and sometimes you would get enemies, especially bosses, that can actually use their really strong ultimate attack on turn 4, and basically, turn 3 or even earlier, for example. And basically, having this Recollection, which lasts for such a long time, can potentially mitigate some of those really strong attacks from the boss enemies, etc. So that's kind of why I do feel like it's still worthwhile getting up, even though the damage reduction is pretty small. Then we have this one. This one gives a revive status, and also because its base effect is kind of suited for a DPS character, having a revive status so your DPS can attack 1 more turn is actually pretty handy sometimes. So that's kind of why I think it's pretty decent. Then we have this one. This one I think just give let me once again double check. I think this one just give a straight up damage buff. But let me double check on this. Okay, so the +1 do ability, yeah, increase spell power, curse technique power of all allies by 15% for 3 turns. So yeah, so that can be pretty handy. A lot of the stronger attacks or stronger DPS in this game, for example, Nabara or Gojo use curse energy attacks. So that's kind of why this is actually pretty decent. And then you have this one, which also increase curse technique attack. The buff is not as strong as this, however, this is permanent, which is kind of why I also think is very good to dupe it up. Then we have this and this. Both of them are a revive status, so pretty much you would be using them for the same reason why I put this SSR Recollection here. Then we have a couple which are reducing the damage that you'll be taking. So once again, those are kind of equivalent to this SSR Recollection, and that's kind of why I put them on the same tier. This one I think is a 20% reduction for 2 turns. This one is like a 10% reduction for 3 turns. This one I think get triggered when your HP is below 50%. And basically, wait, let me double check just to make sure I'm actually saying it correctly. Uh, Okay, yeah, so at the start of turn, if HP is below 50%, you are then gonna grant a 30% spell reduction to all enemies. So once again, that can be pretty handy. Now there is a bit of a conditional effect because it have to be when your HP suddenly drop below 50%, and also the enemy will be using like cursed technique attack. That's basically what spell attack is. I'm just looking at some JP translations here. And basically, yeah, it can be handy. It basically just gives a bit of extra protection, not at the start of battle, unlike the other ones, but basically when a certain condition is fulfilled. But that's still good enough for vast majority of the time. And then we have this one, which I think, let me double check. It grants stealth, so basically that's a dodge to everyone else other than yourself for 2 turns. Now it's actually only granting, I think, stealth or dodge for 1 time within those 2 turns. So it's not saying that all the other people will be dodging every single attack. I think it's still only 1 time when they are being attacked, they will be able to dodge it. But once again, that is pretty useful and pretty handy because that's essentially another way of mitigating damage for everyone, for your whole team other than yourself. So that can be still very, very good. Then we move on to the B tier. The first one, Adult Time. This is one of those Recollection, which is actually very good in terms of its base effect, but its dupe 1 ability doesn't do much. Basically, it's like when you use land a crit, you increase the crit rate of your whole team. Now, the same with this is that vast majority of the time you will be playing like, let's say, 2 buffer and 2 DPS, or sometimes even 3 buffer and 1 DPS when you go into the battle. This is a damage buffing Recollection, so you normally want to play this on your DPS. So actually what's going to happen is that yes, you may be triggering this a lot because DPS may be critting, but then you are increasing the crit rate on your support units more than the others, which is kind of why, what's the point of that? Because your support unit vast majority of the time will be buffing rather than attacking. So that's kind of why I don't feel like this is very useful in terms of dupe 1 ability. Then we have this one, Hot Pot Party. Let me double check what this one does again. Okay, so this one, when HP is below 40%, you're going to get damage reduction by 50% for 210. So basically very similar to the ones above here. However, this is only on yourself. So I don't feel like it's as universal and as adaptable as some of the other ones on the A tier. So that's kind of why I move it here. And then similarly for this one gives a dodge when your HP is below, I think, 50% or 40%. Once again, it's only for yourself. So that's kind of why I don't feel like it's as good as some of the higher tier ones. And then we have this one about a local souvenir. I think that's the name. Its dupe 1 ability. It's able to increase your physical attack and also cursed attack when your special gauge is at maximum. So once again, it can be useful in the sense that you are trying to increase, because your ultimate attack is going to be filled up at that point. You will essentially be increasing the maximum amount of damage on your physical attack. However, if you look at its buff, it's only 15%, and there's a quite tight condition on how you actually want to trigger. So that's kind of why I don't feel like it's as useful as some of the higher level one, which is just kind of like a permanent attack buff or attack buff at the start of turn to make sure that you always know when you'll be using it. So that's kind of the reason why I place it slightly lower tier. But to be honest, now that I think about it, it's probably not bad. Maybe this can be moved up to either the top of B tier or maybe the bottom of A tier. Okay, then let's move on to some of the SR ones. The first one we have is this one. Let me double check what it does again. This one, if your HP is below 50%, you recover 15% of your HP. So basically very similar to the 2 SSR Recollection in front of it. Basically, it's a conditional protection once your HP is already low. So that's kind of why I rated just as highly as the other ones here. Then we have this one. This one I do remember. It's basically every single time when you kill off an enemy, you get an extra 10 curse energy. Now this can be useful for certain characters, especially the AoE character, such as like Mekamora, who use 30 curse energy for an AoE attack. And basically this can potentially allow you to chain AoE attack back to back. So that's kind of why I do feel like it's useful, but it's only really useful when you have like an AoE characters like that. Then we have this. I think the next three, they are basically all to do with increasing the amount of physical attack damage that you can deal. Now the thing is, in this game right now, the strongest DPS are Gojo and Nobara, and they are both curse technique attacks. So that's kind of why I do have some of Recollection, which does similar things but for curse technique, and that I put those on A tier because those are a bit more useful for Gojo and Nobara. Whereas the ones here to do with physical technique attacks, those are more gonna be for Yuji and Maki, and they're just nowhere near as good, so you won't be using them as often. And then lastly, we have this one. This one basically increase your own crit rate and also your damage output. However, the situation with this one is that the base ability is basically plus 10 curse energy, and a lot of time you will actually be putting this card with Recollection on your support unit rather than on your DPS, because on your DPS you normally want to actually play a Recollection which is more like damage focus. And if you think about it that way, this card is normally on support unit. Why does a support unit need an extra bit of attack buff or crit rate? So that's kind of why I don't feel like, even though the buff is not bad, if you actually take into consideration on who will be using this card, it just doesn't seem to apply to them, and that's kind of why I put them in B tier. All right, now let's move on to C tier. This one, it's once again it's a bit of a weird one. This one, basically the effect at Dupe 1 is that when you take, I think, a critical hit, then you apply a damage reduction to your whole team. That sounds really nice on paper because you would be putting it on characters, for example, that has the ability to taunt. And in fact, the base effect of this card is taunting. However, if you think about it, if you have already taunted the enemy into attacking you, why do you need damage reduction on your teammates? Because they wouldn't be attacked at all. So it just kind of doesn't really make sense when you think about it. I think this is only useful when enemy is doing an AoE attack. So therefore your taunt doesn't quite work, but you are still able to protect your whole team. So that may work, but that's a very rare situation because to be honest, there are not that many enemies in this game which does AoE attack. So that's kind of why I don't feel like this is going to be as useful as loads of the other ones are higher tiers. Then we have this one. This one is just a 10% damage reduction on one character, on himself. And then if you compare it to the likes of those in A tier who have like 10% damage reduction for the whole team for multiple turns, this one just seems really weird. Like it's really bad in terms of like dupe 1 ability. And then we have those three here. Those three SSR Recollection basically only get activated from turn 6 onwards. And a lot of time by turn 6, a lot of the important things have already happened. So I just feel like there's not much use of them because it's just a bit too late by the time they actually activate their effect. Then we have this one here. This one is actually really interesting. Basically, when the character that equipped this card dies or retreat from the battlefield, you're going to give a buff to everyone else on your team. Now, this can be actually incredibly useful because basically what happens is that you can actually equip a character, a level 1 character with this, let that character use taunt, so he will be attacked for sure and then he will die, and therefore your whole team suddenly get a permanent buff. So it can be very strong if you use it like that, but the only problem is that you actually require one of your character to die, and that basically means for certain missions where you need to fulfill like a 3-star condition where none of your character can be killed off, this is not going to work there. And likewise, you are kind of robbing yourself of one extra slot of a character who can potentially do something useful. And that's kind of why I feel like, yes, I can see the reason why this is good, but in practice, it's probably going to be very rare you actually are able to use the additional effect of this card effectively. And that's kind of why I placed it here. Then we move on to this one. Let me remind myself what this one does again. Okay, so this one at the start of battle, all allies receive 10% less damage. So like I said, there are already cards which are able to do 10% damage reduction for multiple turns. So once again, in comparison, this one is no longer any good. And then this one basically increases your crit rate when your HP is less than 50%. Crit rate increase doesn't sound bad on paper, but once again, in this game, you can just kind of restart the battle with no cost whatsoever. So if you're not lucky enough to get a crit, you can pretty much just restart the battle for a lucky attack when it actually lands in crit. So that's kind of why I feel like, yes, I can see some benefit of it, but why don't you just restart the battle instead and you can achieve the same effect?